The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Logan International Airport, casting long shadows across the busy terminal as passengers hurried to their gates. At Gate B7, a well-dressed woman in her early 50s clutched her designer handbag, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against her phone screen as she watched the activities outside on the tarmac. Her attention was drawn to a figure walking around the aircraft, conducting what appeared to be a routine pre-flight inspection. The pilot, a black man with graying temples and the confident bearing that came from decades of experience, moved with practiced precision as he checked each crucial component of the plane. The woman's expression shifted from impatience to visible discomfort. She watched him complete his inspection and enter the cockpit, her lips pressed into a thin line. Without warning, she marched up to the gate agent's desk, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying across the waiting area. "Is that pilot flying our plane today?" She pointed toward the cockpit, making no attempt to lower her voice. The gate agent, a young Asian woman with a neat bun and a professional smile, looked up from her computer. "Yes, ma'am. That's our captain for today's flight." "Well, that simply won't do," the woman declared, drawing curious glances from nearby passengers. "I need to be rebooked on another flight. Immediately." Her words carried an undercurrent of prejudice that made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. The gate agent's smile remained fixed, though her eyes hardened slightly. "Ma'am, I can assure you that our captain has an outstanding record with over 2 decades of flying experience. He's one of our most respected pilots. I don't care about his experience." The woman snapped, her voice rising. I don't feel comfortable. Surely you understand." She leaned closer to the desk, speaking in what she probably thought was a conspiratorial whisper, but was still clearly audible to those nearby. Other passengers began to stare openly now. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, covering the child's ears. An elderly gentleman in a business suit shook his head disapprovingly. 2 college students exchanged disgusted looks as they documented the scene on their phones. The gate agent maintained her composure, though her voice took on a firmer edge. "Ma'am, this flight is completely full. If you wish to take a different flight, the next available one departs at 9 p.m., arriving in Chicago well past midnight." The woman's face flushed red. She pulled out her phone, frantically scrolling through her calendar. "But I have an important meeting tomorrow morning. This is completely unacceptable. I demand to speak to your supervisor." As if on cue, the captain emerged from the cockpit for his final cabin check. Despite the commotion at the gate desk, he carried himself with quiet dignity. His eyes met the woman's briefly, and he gave her the same professional nod he offered all passengers. The simple gesture seemed to make her even more flustered. A small crowd had gathered now, watching the scene unfold with a mix of fascination and disapproval. The woman's prejudice hung in the air like a heavy cloud, making the atmosphere at Gate B7 increasingly tense. Several passengers began recording discreetly on their phones, while others whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the display of such blatant discrimination in 2024. The gate agent's supervisor appeared, having been alerted to the situation. But before he could even address the issue, the final boarding call echoed through the terminal. The woman stood at the desk, trapped between her prejudice and the reality of her schedule, as other passengers began lining up to board, carefully avoiding her gaze. The gate agent's fingers flew across her keyboard, her calm exterior masking her growing frustration. The supervisor, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, stepped forward to address the situation. He'd handled difficult passengers before, but something about this woman's barely concealed prejudice made his stomach turn. "Ma'am," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "I understand you have concerns, but I can personally vouch for our captain's excellence. He's successfully completed over 15,000 flights and has received numerous safety awards throughout his career." The woman shifted her weight from one expensive heel to the other, her designer watch catching the morning light, as she gestured dismissively. "That's not the point," she insisted, lowering her voice to a whisper that somehow seemed louder than her previous outburst. "I'm just not comfortable with someone like him in charge of such a complex machine." A businessman waiting nearby couldn't contain himself any longer. "Someone like him," he repeated, loud enough for others to hear. "You mean someone who's spent decades mastering their profession?" His words hung in the air like a challenge. The woman spun around, clutching her handbag tighter. "This is a private conversation," she snapped, though her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she noticed more passengers recording the scene on their phones. The supervisor maintained his professional demeanor, though his jaw tightened slightly. "Let me check all possible alternatives for you," he offered, knowing full well there were none. His fingers danced across another keyboard, the clicking sounds punctuating the tense atmosphere. Behind them, the boarding process had begun. Families with small children went first, parents hurrying their little ones past the unfolding scene. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking loudly why the lady was being mean about the pilot. The mother quickly shushed her, but the innocent question seemed to pierce the bubble of self-righteousness around the difficult passenger. The supervisor looked up from his screen, his expression carefully neutral. "I've checked every flight to Chicago today. As my colleague mentioned, the next available seat is on the 9 p.m. flight. However, that flight has a layover in Detroit, which means you wouldn't arrive until 2 a.m. tomorrow morning." The woman's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide her growing panic. She pulled out her phone again, swiping through her calendar with trembling fingers. "But my presentation, I'm leading the morning session at 9 a.m. sharp. This is absolutely unacceptable." A flight attendant emerged from the jet bridge, her professional smile never wavering as she announced the boarding of Zone 2. More passengers filed past, some openly glaring at the woman, others purposefully avoiding eye contact. The supervisor spread his hands in a gesture of finality. "Those are your options, ma'am. You can either take your assigned seat on this flight, or I can rebook you for the evening departure. But I need your decision now, as we're on a tight schedule." The woman looked around wildly, as if searching for support, but found only disapproving faces. Through the large windows, she could see the ground crew finishing their preparations. The reality of her situation was closing in like the clouds gathering on the horizon. In the cockpit, visible through the terminal windows, the captain continued his pre-flight checks with methodical precision, completely professional despite knowing the drama unfolding because of him. His steady movements and calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the chaos he had inadvertently caused. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal. Zone 4 passengers were lining up, giving the woman and the growing scene around her desk a wide berth. The supervisor stood patiently, his tablet in hand, waiting for her decision. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second bringing them closer to departure time, each moment forcing the woman closer to a choice she never thought she'd have to make. Time had run out. With her perfectly manicured hands shaking slightly, the woman finally surrendered her boarding pass to the gate agent. The last passenger to board, she walked down the jet bridge as if heading to her own execution, her designer heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm that matched her racing heart. The gentle hum of the aircraft's systems grew louder as she approached the plane's entrance. The lead flight attendant greeted her with a professional smile, though her eyes held a knowing look. Word of the gate incident had already spread through the crew's quiet whispers. As she entered the aircraft, the woman couldn't avoid passing the open cockpit door. The captain was there, running through his final checks with practiced ease. Without missing a beat in his routine, he looked up and offered her the same warm greeting he'd given every other passenger. "Welcome aboard." His voice was rich and confident, carrying decades of experience in those two simple words. The woman hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the simple humanity of the interaction. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she clutched her handbag tighter and hurried past. The walk down the aisle felt endless. Other passengers watched her pass, some with obvious disapproval, others deliberately burying their faces in magazines or phones. A young girl whispered something to her mother, who quickly shushed her while giving the woman a cold stare. Her seat was near the middle of the plane. 14C, an aisle seat she would normally have appreciated. Now it felt like a spotlight as she struggled to store her designer bag in the overhead compartment. Nobody offered to help, though several seemed to take satisfaction in her struggle. A businessman in the window seat of her row was typing rapidly on his laptop, pointedly ignoring her presence. The middle seat remained empty for a moment, until an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes approached. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice carrying a gentle southern lilt that somehow managed to sound both sweet and subtly reproachful. As they settled in, the captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and professional. "Good morning, folks. This is your captain speaking. We're looking at clear skies for most of our journey to Chicago today, with an expected flight time of 2 hours and 15 minutes. The woman stared straight ahead, her hands gripping the armrests as the safety demonstration began. She could feel eyes on her from several directions, other passengers stealing glances, flight attendants watching her with measured expressions. The weight of her earlier behavior hung heavy in the recycled cabin air. Through the window, she could see the ground crew finishing their final checks. Each thumbs up they gave the cockpit seemed to mock her earlier doubts. The aircraft's engines hummed to life, their powerful sound a testament to the complex machine she had questioned the captain's ability to control. As they began to taxi, the elderly woman beside her pulled out a rosary and began to pray quietly. A pre-flight ritual, perhaps, or maybe a prayer for something more. The woman found herself listening to the soft murmur of Latin words, finding an odd comfort in their ancient rhythm. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, explaining their position in the takeoff queue. His calm professionalism was impossible to ignore now. Each word he spoke carried the weight of thousands of successful flights, of countless lives safely carried through the clouds. As they waited for takeoff clearance, the woman's phone buzzed with an email, a reminder about tomorrow's presentation, the very reason she was on this flight, trapped in a situation of her own making. She switched the phone to airplane mode with trembling fingers, suddenly very aware of how her prejudices had nearly derailed her own career plans. The engines rose to a roar as they lined up on the runway. In that moment, as the aircraft prepared to leave the Earth behind, the woman realized she had no choice but to put her life in the very hands she had so publicly doubted. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her, nor on the dozens of passengers who had witnessed her earlier display of prejudice. The first hour of the flight passed smoothly, almost lulling the passengers into forgetting the drama at the gate. The woman had started reviewing her presentation on her tablet, trying to focus on tomorrow's meeting instead of her lingering embarrassment. The elderly lady beside her had dozed off, her silver head occasionally nodding with the gentle movement of the plane. The captain's voice came over the intercom, his tone still professional, but with a new edge of seriousness. "Folks, we're about to hit some turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Flight attendants quickly moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts and securing loose items. The first bump was gentle, barely enough to disturb the elderly woman's sleep, but the second hit like a hammer, causing several passengers to gasp. The woman's tablet jumped from her hands, clattering to the floor. As she reached for it, a third jolt rattled the entire cabin. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," the elderly woman muttered, suddenly wide awake and clutching her rosary beads. The businessman by the window had stopped typing, his knuckles white against his armrests. The plane dropped suddenly, as if the air beneath them had disappeared. A child somewhere behind them started crying. Overhead bins rattled ominously. The seatbelt sign's chime seemed almost laughably inadequate for the situation. Through the window, dark clouds pressed against the aircraft. Rain began pelting the glass, drumming an irregular rhythm that matched the passengers' racing hearts. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in brief, harsh bursts. The woman found herself gripping her armrests so tightly that her expensive rings were cutting into her fingers. All her earlier prejudices seemed ridiculous now, replaced by a primal fear of being suspended in a metal tube thousands of feet above the earth. Another violent shake sent a drink cart rolling backward. A flight attendant caught it just in time, securing it with practiced efficiency despite her own obvious tension. "Everything's normal," she announced to the cabin, her voice steady but slightly higher than usual. "Just some weather we need to get through." The captain's voice returned, calm and clear despite the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered an unexpected weather system. I'm working with air traffic control to find a smoother route. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The woman found herself listening intently to his voice now, searching for any sign of worry or uncertainty. She found none. The same steady confidence she had questioned earlier now seemed like a lifeline. The elderly woman beside her had begun praying in earnest, her whispered words mixing with the storm's fury. The businessman had closed his laptop, no longer pretending to work. Across the aisle, a young couple held hands tightly, their earlier movie forgotten on their shared screen. Another drop, longer this time. Someone screamed. The plane seemed to hover for a moment before stabilizing. The woman's stomach lurched and she closed her eyes, trying to remember the breathing exercises from her yoga class. Through it all, the engines maintained their steady hum. The woman found herself focusing on that sound, realizing it hadn't wavered once. Despite the turbulence, the plane's path remained controlled. Each correction was smooth, professional, the work of experienced hands at the controls. The captain's voice came through again. "We're working to climb above this weather system. It should be smoother at a higher altitude. Flight attendants, remain seated for now." His words were measured, reassuring. The voice of someone who had seen worse and knew exactly what to do. The woman opened her eyes, catching a glimpse of another passenger filming the storm on their phone. She wondered if they had also filmed her earlier at the gate. How foolish her fears about the pilot seemed now, as he expertly guided them through nature's fury. The real test of ability wasn't in someone's appearance, but in moments like these, when lives depended on skill, experience, and cool-headed professionalism. Just as the turbulence began to ease, a commotion erupted 3 rows behind the woman. A flight attendant rushed past, her professional calm giving way to urgency. Sir, can you hear me?" The words cut through the cabin's nervous atmosphere like a knife. The woman turned in her seat, as did most of the passengers. A middle-aged man in a business suit was slumped forward, his skin ashen and clammy. His seatmate, a young college student, was frantically trying to get his attention while pressing the call button repeatedly. "Is there a doctor on board?" The lead flight attendant's voice carried through the cabin, steady but urgent. "Any medical professionals, please identify yourselves." The request echoed again, met with uncomfortable silence and worried glances between passengers. The woman felt her heart racing, but for a different reason now. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, muscle memory from 20 years of emergency room work flooding back. She hadn't practiced medicine in 5 years, not since trading her scrubs for business suits and boardroom presentations. Another flight attendant hurried past with the plane's emergency medical kit. The man's breathing was becoming labored, each breath a visible struggle. "His pulse is really weak," the first flight attendant announced, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. 20 years of saving lives in the ER flashed through the woman's mind. How many times had she seen these symptoms? How many lives had passed through her hands? Her earlier prejudices seemed even more shameful now, as another human being needed help just a few feet away. Finally, she stood up. "I'm a former ER nurse," she announced, her voice stronger than she felt. The relief on the flight attendants' faces was immediate and profound. They quickly made space for her to reach the struggling passenger. The man's tie was already loosened, but his collar was still too tight. The woman's fingers moved automatically, checking his pulse, his pupils, his breathing. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, slipping effortlessly back into her medical role. "It started about 2 minutes ago," The college student replied, his voice shaking. He was fine one moment, then he grabbed his chest and couldn't catch his breath. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical situation on board. Please remain in your seats and give our medical responder space to work." His calm professionalism helped keep other passengers from panicking. The woman worked methodically, her business attire incongruous with her precise medical movements. "I need the AED," she called out, recognizing the signs of cardiac distress. The flight attendant quickly retrieved it from its storage compartment. As she attached the monitoring pads to the man's chest, the woman found herself working in perfect sync with the flight crew. The same professionals she had doubted earlier were now her team, anticipating her needs, keeping other passengers calm, and maintaining clear communication with the cockpit. The AED beeped steadily, confirming her suspicions. "He's having a cardiac event," she announced. The man's eyes fluttered open briefly, fear visible in them. "You're in good hands," she assured him, surprised by how naturally the words came back to her. "We're going to take care of you." Through it all, she could feel the plane banking slowly, the captain already coordinating with air traffic control for an emergency landing. The same steady hands she had questioned were now working to get them quickly and safely to the nearest airport, where proper medical care waited. The elderly woman with the rosary had started a quiet prayer circle in her row. The businessman who had ignored everyone earlier was now helping to keep track of time. Even the college student, despite his obvious fear, was calmly following instructions to help keep his seatmate stable. Time seemed to move differently in a crisis. The woman's world had narrowed to the space around her patient, her hand steady as she monitored his vital signs. The AED continued its rhythmic beeping, each sound a reminder of how precarious life could be at 35,000 feet. "Blood pressure's dropping," she announced to the flight attendant beside her. Years of medical training took over, pushing aside all thoughts of business meetings and earlier prejudices. Here, in this moment, nothing mattered except saving a life. The captain's voice came through the speakers again, steady as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're being diverted to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. Emergency medical services will meet us upon landing. Please remain calm and in your seats." The sick passenger's breathing had become more labored. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he struggled to remain conscious. The woman noticed his wedding ring, thinking about the family waiting for him somewhere. Every decision she made now could affect whether he saw them again. "Do you have any aspirin in the medical kit?" she asked the flight attendant, who quickly retrieved it. The woman's mind raced through her old emergency protocols. "Sir," she addressed her patient gently, "can you swallow these? They'll help." The man managed a weak nod. The college student beside him helped hold his head up as he took the medicine. His eyes were full of fear, but there was trust there too. Trust in this woman who had stepped up to help him, despite her earlier behavior at the gate. The cabin had grown eerily quiet. Other passengers watched the scene unfold, their own problems forgotten in the face of this stark reminder of human fragility. The elderly woman with the rosary had gathered a small group who were praying quietly, their whispered words a gentle backdrop to the medical drama. Through the window, the woman could see they were descending through clouds. The captain was taking them down faster than normal, but so smoothly that most passengers might not have noticed. His skill was evident in every banking turn, every adjustment. 5 minutes to landing, the lead flight attendant announced. "Everyone please check that your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are up." The woman faced a crucial decision. The patient needed to be moved closer to the exit for quick evacuation, but moving him was risky. Her medical training warred with the turbulence still occasionally shaking the plane. She caught the eye of the flight attendant. "We need to get him to the front," she said firmly. "It's a risk, but seconds will count once we're on the ground." The flight attendant nodded, immediately understanding the gravity of the decision. Other passengers instantly volunteered to help. The businessman who had been so absorbed in his laptop earlier was now offering his strength to help carry the patient, A former military service member from the back offered his expertise in careful transport. The woman orchestrated the move with precision, giving clear, calm instructions. On my count. Gentle but quick. Support his head. Watch the armrests. The teamwork was seamless, as if these strangers had trained together for years. As they secured the patient in a front row seat, the woman caught a glimpse of the cockpit. The captain was fully focused on his instruments, coordinating with air traffic control, his hand sure on the controls. In that moment, she saw him not as a black pilot, but simply as a skilled professional working to save a life, just as she was. The plane began its final descent, the ground growing closer through breaks in the clouds. Emergency vehicles were already visible on the tarmac, their lights flashing a promise of help. The woman held her patient's wrist, monitoring his pulse, feeling the weight of responsibility and the strange twist of fate that had put her in this position. The descent into Cleveland was unlike anything most passengers had experienced. The captain's voice came over the intercom one last time. Cabin crew, prepare for immediate arrival. Emergency vehicles are standing by. His words were measured, professional, each syllable carrying years of training and experience. Rain pelted the windows as they broke through the clouds. The woman kept her fingers on her patient's pulse, counting each beat like precious gems. His breathing had stabilized somewhat, but his skin remained pale and clammy. The medicine was helping, but he needed proper medical care soon. The flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, checking seatbelts and securing loose items at double speed. Their movements were smooth despite the urgency, helping keep the other passengers calm. The lead flight attendant positioned herself near the front exit, ready to coordinate with emergency services the moment they landed. Through the windows, passengers could see the airport approaching fast. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, their lights cutting through the gray day like beacons of hope. Several people gasped as they descended more quickly than usual, but the captain's skill was evident in how he maintained perfect control. The woman felt the familiar sensation of her stomach lifting as they made their final approach. She braced herself and her patient, speaking soft words of encouragement. We're almost there. Help is waiting. Just stay with us a little longer. The college student who had been the patient's seatmate had moved to the front as well, holding the sick man's hand and offering quiet support. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud that vibrated through the cabin. The woman could see the runway rushing up to meet them, faster than a normal landing but still controlled. She silently thanked the pilot she had so wrongly judged, knowing that his expertise was now crucial to their survival. The touchdown was firm but precise. The plane's reverse thrusters roared to life, their sound drowning out everything else as they rapidly decelerated. The captain handled the heavy braking masterfully, keeping the aircraft perfectly straight despite the wet runway. Emergency vehicles were already moving alongside them as they taxied, keeping pace with military precision. The woman could see ambulance crews jumping out, preparing their equipment even before the plane had come to a complete stop. As soon as they halted, the captain's voice came through one last time. Emergency crews are boarding now. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions. The door opened almost immediately, and paramedics rushed in with their equipment, their movements quick but controlled. The woman found herself seamlessly integrating with the emergency team, passing on vital information in the clipped professional language of medical personnel. Male, mid-50s, possible cardiac event. Administered aspirin. Pulse weak but stable. The words flowed automatically, her business executive persona completely forgotten in the return to her medical roots. The other passengers watched in respectful silence as the paramedics transferred the patient to a stretcher. The elderly woman with the rosary was still praying, her beads clicking softly. The businessman who had helped with the move earlier was now helping keep the aisle clear. Everyone seemed to understand their role in this impromptu community of care. Through the cockpit door, which had been opened to assist with the evacuation, the woman caught sight of the captain. He was still at his controls, completing his emergency procedures with the same precise professionalism he'd shown throughout the flight. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, something profound passed between them. A mutual recognition of dedication to duty, of lives placed in caring hands, of prejudices dissolved in the face of true skill and humanity. As the paramedics wheeled the patient away, a strange calm settled over the aircraft. The woman stood in the aisle, her designer suit wrinkled from kneeling on the floor, her hand still bearing the ghost sensation of checking vital signs. Around her, the other passengers began to stir, as if waking from a shared dream. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp despite the crisis they'd just navigated. He moved with quiet authority through the cabin, checking on passengers, coordinating with ground crew, and managing the situation with the same steady hand that had guided them safely through the storm. The woman watched him work, really seeing him for the first time. Every action spoke of experience and professionalism, from the way he briefed the emergency crews to how he reassured nervous passengers about their connecting flights. This was a man who had earned his position through years of dedication, skill, and unwavering commitment to his passengers' safety. Through the windows, she could see airport staff hurrying around the plane, checking equipment, conferring with ground control. The emergency vehicles were still there, their lights now silent, but their presence a reminder of how close they'd come to tragedy. If not for the captain's quick thinking and steady hands, the outcome might have been very different. The lead flight attendant was making announcements about rebooking options, her voice carrying over the soft murmur of passengers calling loved ones. The woman barely heard any of it. She was lost in thought, remembering her behavior at the gate, seeing it now through new eyes. How small her prejudices seemed in the face of real crisis, how meaningless in light of true professional excellence. The elderly woman with the rosary approached her, touching her arm gently. "You did good work today," she said softly, her kind eyes twinkling. "Just like our captain. When it matters, it's not about who we are, but what we can do for others, isn't it?" The woman felt tears prick at her eyes, understanding the gentle rebuke wrapped in those words of praise. She watched as the captain spoke with a young family, kneeling down to explain to their frightened child how the plane had helped them save someone's life today. His patience and kindness were evident in every gesture. Other passengers were sharing their own observations now. The businessman who had helped move the patient was telling others how smoothly the landing had been, despite the emergency speed. The college student was describing how calm the captain's voice had remained throughout the crisis, helping everyone stay focused and hopeful. A ground crew member entered the plane with updates about the patient. "He's stable," she announced. "The doctors say getting him to the ground so quickly made all the difference." The woman felt a wave of relief, but also shame. She had questioned this captain's abilities, yet his skill and quick decisions had helped save a life today. The captain was now speaking with the Cleveland airport staff about weather conditions and flight plans. His knowledge was evident in every question he asked, every detail he considered. The woman found herself amazed at the complexity of his job, not just flying the plane, but managing countless variables while keeping hundreds of lives safe. Through the still open cabin door, she could see the medical team's vehicle pulling away, carrying their patient to the hospital. The sun was breaking through the clouds now, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Somewhere in Chicago, her business presentation seemed trivially unimportant compared to what she had witnessed today. True professionalism, unwavering dedication, and the complete irrelevance of prejudice in the face of real human needs. As the airport ground crew prepared the aircraft for its continued journey, the woman found herself standing near the cockpit, her heart pounding almost as hard as it had during the medical emergency. The captain was completing paperwork with the ground team, his movements still precise and professional despite the intensity of the past hour. She waited until he finished, gathering her courage. Other passengers watched curiously. They all remembered her behavior at the gate. The elderly woman with the rosary gave her an encouraging nod, while the businessman who had helped during the crisis smiled slightly. "Captain," she said softly, her voice shakier than she'd expected. He turned to face her, his expression professional but kind. The woman took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her earlier words pressing down on her. "I owe you an apology," she continued, her voice growing stronger with sincerity. "What I did at the gate was—" She paused, searching for words strong enough to convey her regret. "It was inexcusable. I let prejudice cloud my judgment, and I couldn't have been more wrong." The captain listened quietly, his face showing neither anger nor judgment. Around them, the cabin had grown silent, other passengers and crew members witnessing this moment of truth. "Today, you didn't just prove me wrong," she went on, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "You showed me what real professionalism looks like. You saved that man's life with your quick thinking and skilled flying. And you did it all while treating me with more dignity than I deserved." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "I'm not just apologizing. I'm thanking you. You've taught me a lesson I'll never forget. One that has nothing to do with flying and everything to do with being human." The captain's response was measured, his voice carrying the same steady confidence it had shown throughout the flight. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "But today wasn't about proving anything. It was about doing the job I love and taking care of the people in my care. That's all it's ever been about." The woman nodded, wiping away a tear. "I understand that now, and I promise you, I'm going to take this lesson forward. Others need to hear this story, need to understand how wrong these prejudices are." The elderly woman had moved closer, her rosary beads clicking softly. "Sometimes," she said gently, "God puts us in situations that open our eyes and hearts. The question is, what do we do with that wisdom?" The captain smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes. "The best apology is changed behavior," he said. "And from what I saw today, how you stepped up to help that passenger, you're already on that path." Other passengers began sharing their own reflections. The college student talked about how this experience had changed his perspective. The businessman mentioned how he'd be sharing this story with his company's diversity training program. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out her business card. "I give presentations to corporate leadership teams," she said. "But I think I need to change tomorrow's topic. Would you be willing to let me share this story? People need to hear it." The captain accepted her card with a nod. If it helps someone else overcome their prejudices, then some good will come from this morning's difficulties. As the crew prepared for the continuing flight to Chicago, the woman returned to her seat, transformed. Her phone buzzed with messages about tomorrow's presentation, but she was already drafting a new speech in her mind, one about prejudice and professionalism, about life and death moments that strip away our preconceptions, about the dangers of judging others before knowing their true measure. The engines hummed to life again, and this time, the woman felt only gratitude and respect for the hands guiding them. She had boarded this plane a different person, someone she wasn't proud to have been, but she would leave it changed, carrying a story that needed to be told and a lesson that needed to be shared.